she whispered, "Don't stop, cowboy," as he trapped her by the cabin door in the snowstorm. It was late afternoon when Claire first realized she had lost her way. The sun had already begun its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies, painting the sky in shades of pale orange and icy blue. She had been traveling for hours, determined to reach the small town where she hoped to spend the night, but the trail she had been following had disappeared under a sudden blanket of fresh snow. Every few steps her boots sank into the powder, and the cold began to creep in, biting through the layers of clothing she had packed. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and tightened the straps of her backpack, hoping that if she moved fast enough she might find shelter before darkness fully set in. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees and making them sway and groan. It carried with it a sharp icy chill that cut across her face. Claire pulled her hood over her head and kept moving, though each step was heavier than the last. She had traveled alone for a long time, enjoying the freedom of the open roads, but tonight the isolation felt different. The world seemed smaller, the mountains taller, and the snow deeper. Every sound was amplified: the crunch of her boots in the snow, the distant howl of a coyote, and the eerie whistle of the wind. As the shadows lengthened, Claire realized she had no landmarks left to guide her. The trail she had been following was completely covered, and the path ahead looked the same in every direction. Panic tried to creep in, but she forced it back. She had faced harsh conditions before. She knew that the first rule in a snowstorm was to stay calm, to think clearly, and to move with purpose. But as the snow began to fall harder, a fine cold drizzle at first and then thick heavy flakes, it became more difficult to see even a few feet ahead. Her breath came in short, visible clouds, and her fingers were growing numb inside her gloves. She scanned the horizon, looking for anything that might offer hope. Then, through the curtain of falling snow, she saw it, a faint glow. At first, she wasn't sure if it was real or just a trick of her tired eyes. But as she focused, the light grew brighter, a steady flicker like a candle or a lamp inside a distant cabin. Relief surged through her and her pace quickened. Each step felt lighter, as if the thought of warmth and shelter had given her new strength. She pushed through the snow, leaving uneven footprints behind her, hoping desperately that the cabin was real and that someone inside would offer help. The closer she got, the more the cold seemed to intensify. The snow had started to pile up faster, driven by a sudden gust of wind that seemed to come from nowhere. Claire had to bend forward, using her hands to shield her face as she fought against the wind. Her boots were wet, and her socks were beginning to feel damp and heavy. Every part of her ached, but she kept going, driven by the light ahead and the knowledge that stopping meant danger. The snowstorm was relentless, and the idea of being stuck in the open night was frightening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Claire reached a small clearing. The light was brighter now, and she could make out the outline of a log cabin, nestled among tall pine trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, rising into the darkening sky, a sign that someone was home. Her heart lifted. Relief washed over her in waves. She stepped closer, feeling the snow crunch under her boots, and noticed the door was partially open. A warm glow spilled out, painting the snow in soft golds and ambers. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should knock. The cabin looked abandoned, and the surrounding woods seemed silent except for the wind. But the warmth called to her, and she realized she couldn't stay outside any longer. Gathering her courage, she stepped up to the door and knocked gently. A sound echoed inside, swallowed almost immediately by the storm outside. She waited, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. From inside, a shadow moved across the doorway. A figure appeared, a man with rugged features and clothing that spoke of someone who lived close to the land. His eyes, sharp and observant, studied her for a moment. Claire could feel the intensity of his gaze, and though she was cold and tired, she also felt a strange curiosity stir in her. He didn't speak at first, just watched her, as if trying to measure her resolve. I'm sorry to bother you," Claire said, her voice slightly trembling from the cold. I'm lost. Could I maybe come in for a little while? Just until the storm passes?" The man didn't answer immediately. He took a step aside, motioning toward the cabin. "You can come in," he said finally, his voice low but steady. It had a calm authority that made her feel both nervous and relieved. She stepped inside, and warmth enveloped her immediately. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood, pine, and something earthy, like leather or soil. Her fingers and toes, numb from the cold, began to thaw slowly, and she could feel life returning to her limbs. The cabin was small but cozy. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The furniture was simple and sturdy, all made of wood. A few blankets were draped over chairs, and there was a small table with mugs and a kettle. Claire's eyes wandered, taking in every detail, grateful for the refuge. The man, whose name she soon learned was Jack, went about tending the fire, stacking another log carefully to ensure the flames would last. He moved with a calm efficiency that spoke of experience and self-reliance. Claire couldn't help but notice how different he seemed from anyone she had ever met. There was a quiet strength in his presence, a groundedness that made the cabin feel safe despite the storm raging outside. As she warmed herself by the fire, she couldn't help but glance out the window at the swirling snow. The storm had not let up, and the world outside was white and wild. She felt a mixture of awe and unease. Nature was beautiful, but it was also relentless, capable of swallowing everything in its path. And yet, here, in the small cabin with a stranger, she felt a fragile sense of safety. Jack handed her a cup of steaming tea, and she accepted it gratefully, feeling the warmth seep into her chest. They exchanged few words, the silence filled with the sound of the fire and the wind outside. It was a quiet, tense, and almost sacred moment. Two strangers brought together by circumstance, each sizing up the other, each aware of the fragile trust forming in the warmth of the cabin. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time seemed different inside the cabin, measured not by the sun or clocks, but by the rhythm of the storm outside. Claire found herself relaxing bit by bit, the fear of being lost and alone slowly giving way to curiosity and quiet fascination. Jack, in turn, seemed to study her with interest, noticing her determination, the way she had braved the storm alone. There was something in her eyes, something that told him she was more than she appeared, strong, independent, and unafraid of life's challenges, even in the face of danger. By the time darkness fully settled over the mountains, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Outside, the wind howled, and the snow fell relentlessly. Inside, the cabin remained a small, glowing haven, a pocket of warmth and life in a frozen world. Claire sipped her tea, feeling the tension of the day slowly ebb, though a sense of anticipation lingered in the air. She didn't know what lay ahead, who this man was beyond the cabin walls, or how long she would have to stay here. But for now she was safe, and that was enough. As she looked around, taking in the details, the sturdy logs, the flickering firelight, and the quiet strength of the man tending it, Claire realized that sometimes being lost could lead you to exactly where you needed to be. And sometimes the most unexpected encounters could hold the most unforgettable stories. The storm outside showed no sign of slowing. Snow piled against the walls of the cabin, and the wind rattled the roof, sending occasional gusts through the small cracks in the logs. Inside, the warmth of the fire made the cabin feel like a different world, a quiet, glowing sanctuary in the midst of the harsh winter. Claire sat on the edge of a wooden chair, her fingers wrapped around the steaming mug of tea Jack had given her. She had never felt such a mixture of relief and curiosity. Relief that she had found shelter, and curiosity about the man who had opened his home to a stranger. Jack moved around the cabin with a calm efficiency. He checked the fire, adjusted the logs, and made sure the small room stayed warm. Every motion was precise, almost mechanical, yet there was a quiet grace in the way he handled himself. He seemed aware of everything, how the fire was burning, how the wind pressed against the walls, and even how Claire was sitting, her body tense yet alert. His eyes would occasionally meet hers, sharp and steady, as if reading her thoughts without a word being spoken. "I don't often have visitors," Jack said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was low and steady, with a calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos outside. "Especially not ones who wander into the mountains during the storm." "I wasn't planning on it," she replied. "I just got caught in the storm. I didn't know where else to go." Jack nodded, his expression unreadable, though his eyes softened slightly. "The mountains can be unforgiving," he said. "One wrong step, one moment of hesitation, and you can end up in trouble fast. You're lucky you found the cabin when you did." Claire felt a shiver run down her spine, though it wasn't entirely from the cold. There was something about Jack's presence that made her more aware of herself, her movements, her voice, even her thoughts. He had a quiet intensity that was both intimidating and intriguing. She realized she had never felt this way around anyone before, especially a stranger. They fell into a companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts while the storm raged outside. Claire sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth seep into her body. A big dancing shadows across the cabin walls. The snowstorm outside seemed like a distant memory now, a harsh world that had suddenly faded into insignificance compared to the small, intimate space they shared. "You're traveling alone?" Jack asked after a while, his voice cutting through the silence. Claire nodded. "Yes. I've been on the road for a few months. I like seeing new places, meeting new people, experiencing life in my own way." She hesitated, then added, "But tonight I might have pushed my luck too far." Jack studied her for a moment, then nodded again. "Adventure has its price," he said quietly. "Some people aren't prepared for it, but I can tell you you're tougher than most. Not many would have kept moving in a storm like this." Claire felt a small surge of pride. It was nice to be recognized for her strength, even if it was only by a stranger. She sipped her tea, letting the words sink in. There was a strange comfort in knowing that someone else could see her resilience, even without knowing her fully. As the storm continued to batter the cabin, Jack moved closer to the window, peering out into the whiteness. "It's not going to let up soon," he said. "You'll be stuck here for a while. Might as well make yourself comfortable." It was small but functional, with everything needed for survival in the mountains. A few blankets were folded neatly on a chair, and a small bed was tucked into the corner. The simplicity of the space was calming. She realized how easy it was to forget the harshness of the world outside when surrounded by warmth and safety. Jack seemed to notice her gaze. "You can use that bed if you want," he said. "It's not much, but it'll keep you warm." Claire shook her head. "I'm fine sitting here by the fire for now," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, accepting her answer, though his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. There was a weight in his gaze, a mixture of curiosity and something unspoken that made Claire feel both aware and self-conscious. She sipped her tea, feeling the heat spread through her body, and tried to focus on anything other than the man in front of her. Minutes passed, and the storm outside only seemed to grow stronger. Snow slammed against the windows, and the wind howled like a living creature. Claire felt a mix of fear and excitement. The world outside was dangerous and wild, but inside the cabin, everything was calm and safe. Yet there was an undeniable tension between them, a sense that the small space they shared had created a connection neither could ignore. Jack moved to the fireplace again, crouching slightly to adjust the logs. His movements were deliberate, controlled, and Claire couldn't help but watch him. There was something magnetic about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that demanded attention without asking for it. She felt drawn to him, though she wasn't sure why. It wasn't just his appearance, it was the calm strength he exuded, the sense that he could handle anything the world threw at him. "I've lived out here for a long time," Jack said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence again. "Not many come this far into the mountains. Those who do, they usually have a reason. Adventure, curiosity, or sometimes they're just looking for something they can't find anywhere else." Claire met his eyes, feeling a spark of recognition. "Maybe that's true," she said softly. "Maybe I am looking for something I haven't found yet." He seemed content to let her words hang in the air, as if understanding that some things couldn't be explained so easily. The fire crackled, the wind roared outside, and for a moment the two of them simply existed in that quiet, fragile space, each aware of the other but careful not to overstep boundaries. Time moved strangely in the cabin. The storm outside made it impossible to tell how long they had been there. Claire felt a mix of comfort and unease. She was safe, but the isolation and intensity of the situation made her heart beat faster than usual. Every glance, every word, every movement seemed amplified in the small space, creating a tension that was both exciting and a little frightening. Jack finally broke the silence again, his voice low and steady. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "Not just physically, but in the way you handle yourself. Most people would have panicked hours ago." Claire felt a flush rise in her cheeks. She wasn't used to compliments, especially from strangers, but there was sincerity in his tone that made her believe him. She nodded, grateful for the recognition, and sipped her tea, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. They continued to talk, sharing small stories and observations about life in the mountains, the challenges of traveling alone, and the beauty of the wilderness. Claire found herself relaxing more with each passing minute. The tension in her body eased slightly, replaced by a sense of connection and trust she hadn't expected. Jack, in turn, seemed to respond to her presence, his eyes softening and his demeanor becoming slightly more open. Hours passed, and the storm outside showed no sign of slowing. The snow piled higher, and the wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin a different kind of warmth had taken hold, a warmth born of shared experience, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding that they were both alone in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. Claire realized that despite the fear and uncertainty of being lost in the storm, she had found something unexpected. She had found a safe place, a moment of calm, and a connection with someone she had just met. It was a rare feeling, one that she knew she would remember long after the storm had passed. As the night deepened, the fire continued to crackle, casting long shadows on the walls. Claire wrapped her hands around her mug, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers. She watched Jack move around the cabin, noticing the careful way he tended to the fire, the subtle strength in his movements, and the quiet confidence that seemed to define him. For the first time in hours, Claire allowed herself to relax fully. She leaned back in her chair, letting the warmth of the fire and the presence of Jack settle around her. The storm outside was still fierce, but inside she felt a fragile sense of peace. She realized that sometimes, even in the most unexpected circumstances, safety, connection, and understanding could be found in the most unlikely places. The snowstorm outside had grown fiercer as the night deepened. The wind screamed around the cabin like a living creature, throwing snow against the windows in thick, blinding sheets. Claire pressed her hands against the warm mug she held, staring out into the white chaos. Beyond the walls of the cabin, the mountains were hidden under a blizzard that seemed endless. Every gust of wind shook the cabin, making the logs creak and the fire flicker wildly. It was the kind of storm that reminded you of how small and fragile humans could be, and Claire felt the chill of that truth even as the warmth of the fire kept her safe. Jack had moved closer to the fireplace again, crouching to rearrange the logs, making sure the flames would continue to burn steadily. His movements were precise, almost methodical, but there was a awareness in his posture that made Claire conscious of him. He wasn't just tending the fire, he was aware of her presence, watching her from the corner of his eye, and perhaps even measuring her strength, her reactions, her very composure in the storm. Every time she glanced at him, their eyes met briefly, and a silent understanding passed between them. The isolation of the cabin, the intensity of the storm, and the shared experience created a tension that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was quiet, almost electric, like the calm before lightning strikes. Claire felt it in the way her heart beat faster when Jack spoke, in the way the room seemed to shrink when they moved closer to one another, and in the subtle awareness of each other's gestures. She couldn't help but notice the lines of his face, the way his hair fell slightly across his forehead, and the quiet strength in the way he held himself. "Looks like we're stuck here for the night," Jack said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but carried a note of thoughtfulness. He glanced toward the window, watching the storm rage outside, then back at Claire. "The snow isn't letting up any time soon. You're not going anywhere until it passes." Claire nodded, feeling both relief and a strange flutter of anxiety. Being trapped in the cabin with him, so close and so aware of each other, was comforting in one way but also strangely unnerving. I don't mind staying," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's better than being out there." Jack's gaze lingered on her, and for a moment the wind outside seemed to fade away. He studied her quietly, as if weighing whether she truly understood the dangers of the storm and whether she could handle the solitude and isolation that came with it. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of caution and curiosity, that made Claire feel seen in a way she hadn't before. The cabin felt smaller as the night went on, the firelight creating shadows that danced across the walls. Claire shifted in her chair, trying to make herself comfortable, but she couldn't shake the awareness of Jack's presence. He moved around the room with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly what to do in any situation. There was a rhythm to his movements, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the cabin as much as the fire did. "You handled yourself well today," Jack said after a while, his voice low and steady. "Not many people would have made it this far in the storm. Most would have turned back hours ago." Claire felt a warmth rise in her cheeks. It wasn't just the fire. His words carried a weight that made her feel recognized, appreciated, and slightly exposed all at once. I didn't really have a choice," she admitted, sipping her tea. "I had to keep moving. I couldn't stop." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the people who keep going, even when it's hard, are the ones who surprise everyone, including themselves." His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. There was an intensity in that gaze that made Claire's heart skip a beat. She realized she was studying him just as much as he was studying her, noticing the lines of his face, the way his hands moved, and the quiet power that seemed to radiate from him without effort. The storm outside continued to rage, and Claire could hear the snow piling up against the cabin walls. The isolation, the cold, and the intensity of the moment made the small room feel like its own world, detached from time and space. She wrapped her hands around her mug, drawing warmth from it, and felt a strange sense of vulnerability. Being here, alone with Jack in the storm, made her aware of every detail, every flicker of firelight, every subtle sound, every movement he made. Jack moved closer to the window again, peering out into the blizzard. "It's going to be a long night," he said quietly, almost to himself. The wind rattled the cabin and the snow pressed harder against the logs. "We'll just have to make the most of it here until the storm passes." Claire nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. There was something about being confined in this small space with him that created a tension she couldn't ignore. It wasn't threatening. It was alive, palpable, and exciting, in a way she hadn't expected. Every glance they shared, every word they exchanged, seemed to carry more weight than it would have in the open world outside. She noticed the way he moved around the cabin, the way his hands were steady and sure, and the way his eyes continually flicked toward her. It was as if he was aware of everything she did, noticing the smallest details, yet he never made her feel uncomfortable. The awareness between them built, slowly, quietly, like the snow outside, covering everything until it became undeniable. The wind outside howled, rattling the logs, and the fire flickered violently. Claire shifted closer to it, feeling the warmth spread through her body, but she couldn't ignore the tension in the air. It was subtle, a quiet electricity that passed between them with every glance, every shared silence. The cabin had become a small world, suspended in the storm, where two strangers were forced into proximity and connection. Jack finally turned away from the window and faced her. There was a moment of silence as they looked at each other. The weight of the storm outside contrasted with the quiet intensity between them. He didn't speak immediately, but the look in his eyes told Claire that he was aware of the same tension she felt. It was unspoken, a subtle acknowledgement that neither of them could ignore. "Do you want another cup of tea?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an unspoken curiosity. Claire shook her head gently. "No, I think I'm okay for now." Her fingers tightened around the mug, and she felt a flutter in her chest. The closeness of the cabin, the storm outside, and the presence of Jack made her hyper-aware of everything, her thoughts, her feelings, even her breathing. Jack moved to the fire, crouching slightly to tend the logs. The shadows danced across his face, highlighting the strength and calm in his expression. Claire couldn't stop herself from noticing him, from studying him, from feeling drawn to the quiet confidence he carried. It was magnetic, and she found herself both comforted and unsettled by it. The night stretched on, the storm outside showing no mercy. Snow piled higher against the cabin walls, and the wind rattled through every crevice. Inside, the cabin remained a refuge, warm and alive with the fire's glow. Claire felt a mix of safety and anticipation. The storm had trapped them together, and the intensity of the situation had created a connection neither could ignore. As she watched Jack tend the fire, she realized how much she had grown accustomed to his presence. The calm confidence he carried, the quiet strength in his movements, and the intensity of his gaze had a strange effect on her. She felt aware of herself in ways she hadn't before, more alive, more alert, and more aware of the possibilities that this night might hold. Jack glanced at her again, and for a brief moment, their eyes met and held. There was no need for words. Both of them understood the unspoken tension, the quiet electricity that had grown between them. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin had become a small world of warmth, tension, and possibility. Claire sipped the last of her tea, feeling the warmth in her chest. She realized that despite the storm, despite the isolation, she felt a connection that was rare and unexpected. Jack's presence had a weight that was both comforting and exciting, and she knew that the night was far from over. As the wind howled and the snow pressed against the cabin walls, Claire and Jack remained in that small space, aware of each other, aware of the storm, and aware of the growing tension that neither could deny. The storm outside mirrored the storm of emotions building between them, a mixture of fear, excitement, curiosity, and a quiet longing that neither wanted to name just yet. For Claire, the night had become a test of resilience, trust, and awareness. For Jack, it was a moment of cautious observation, recognizing strength and courage in someone who had faced the storm head-on. Together, they existed in a fragile world suspended between the harshness of nature and the warmth of human connection, waiting for the night to unfold and the storm to pass. The snowstorm outside had reached a fierce intensity that even the strongest winds could not surpass. Each gust shook the cabin violently, rattling the wooden walls and sending the windows into a soft, trembling clatter. The world outside was a swirl of white, a blinding wall of snow that erased every familiar shape, every comforting landmark. Claire could hear the snow piling up against the logs, the heavy blanket of the storm pressing on every side, making the cabin feel even smaller, warmer, and more intimate. Inside, the warmth of the fire seemed to throb in time with her heart. Claire wrapped her hands tightly around her mug, letting the heat seep into her fingers, her palms, and eventually in her chest. She could feel the storm outside, hear it, and yet, here in this small cabin, it seemed almost unreal. She had survived storms before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just the cold or the snow. It was the way isolation, proximity, and circumstance had drawn her and Jack into a space where neither could escape the other. Jack sat near the fire, moving slowly, tending the flames with careful attention. The firelight reflected in his eyes, making them look warmer, yet still sharp and steady. Every now and then, his gaze flicked toward Claire, lingering longer than necessary. It wasn't a glance of casual observation. It was thoughtful, deliberate, a silent assessment of her mood, her thoughts, and perhaps even her courage. She felt herself reacting instinctively, pulling her shoulders back, standing taller, and yet also feeling a strange comfort in knowing that someone was paying attention, truly noticing her. The room was quiet except for the fire and the wind. Minutes passed, stretching into an hour or more, the silence carrying weight. Claire sipped her tea slowly, careful not to let the heat escape too quickly. She had never felt such a mixture of relief, curiosity, and subtle tension. The storm outside was dangerous and relentless, but inside the cabin, it had created a space where human connection, however unexpected, could take root. "You're good in a storm," Jack said suddenly, his voice low and calm. He didn't need to look at her to know she was listening. He could feel it in the shift of the air, the way she leaned slightly forward in her chair. Not everyone could have made it this far, especially alone. "You're stronger than most give themselves credit for." Claire felt a small warmth rise in her chest beyond the fire. It wasn't just gratitude for the compliment, it was the recognition that he could see her in a way that few others had. His words carried weight, and because they weren't casual, they weren't flattery. They were observations made with quiet certainty, the kind that could only come from someone who had faced hardship themselves and recognized it in another. I didn't feel strong," she said softly. "At first I was just scared, but I kept moving because I had no choice. I couldn't stop." Jack nodded slowly. "That's the real strength," he said. "Not just surviving, but continuing despite the fear. Most people give up long before they reach the point where they could truly surprise themselves." Claire looked at him, studying his profile by the firelight. He had a quiet, grounded presence, a strength that wasn't loud or aggressive, but steady and dependable. She realized that his confidence, his calm, and his attentiveness were magnetic. She felt drawn to him in a way that surprised her, a combination of curiosity, trust, and a subtle awareness of tension that neither of them had yet named. The storm seemed to intensify as the night progressed, the snow pressing harder against the cabin, the wind rattling through every crevice. Claire felt the weight of isolation more than ever. Out there, she would be completely alone, but here, she was not. Here she had warmth, safety, and the presence of someone who, despite being a stranger, made her feel both seen and protected. Jack moved closer to her side of the cabin, crouching slightly to adjust the fire. The movement drew Claire's attention, and she couldn't help but notice the careful precision in his actions. There was no hurry, no unnecessary motion. Everything he did seemed deliberate. He glanced at her briefly, his eyes meeting hers, and for a heartbeat, the air between them seemed to thrum with unspoken words. The storm outside seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet tension of the moment. "You're awake," he said softly, though his tone suggested he already knew. Claire shifted slightly, realizing that he had been aware of her focus all along. "I'm just watching the fire," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. She could feel her pulse quicken, though she wasn't sure why. There was a strange comfort in his proximity, yet a thrill in the subtle awareness of it. Jack nodded, returning his attention to the fire for a moment before glancing back at her. "It's peaceful here, in a way," he said. "Even with the storm, there's a kind of calm. You notice things you wouldn't in a busy town. You notice people, yourself, life in a different way." Claire considered his words, feeling them resonate. The storm had forced her into isolation, but it had also brought her to a place she would never have found otherwise. She realized that the storm was more than just weather. It was a bridge between fear and trust, between distance and connection. And in this quiet cabin, she could feel herself opening, trusting the moment, trusting him. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing into the air, and Claire could feel the warmth spreading through her chest. She shifted slightly closer, almost instinctively, drawn by the shared energy of the space. Jack noticed, of course, though he didn't comment. His eyes followed her movements with the same quiet intensity, noting without judgment, watching with curiosity and awareness. Time seemed to stretch as they sat together, both aware of the storm, aware of the cabin, and aware of each other. The isolation created a bubble, a temporary world where nothing mattered except the present, the heat of the fire, the sound of the wind, the unspoken tension, and the subtle connection that had formed between them. Claire realized how unusual it was to feel so connected to someone she had just met. There was trust in the air, a fragile understanding that each of them was strong, capable, and worthy of being noticed. "You've been through storms before," Jack said quietly. breaking the silence. "Not just weather storms, but life storms. You carry a strength that's rare." "I can see it." Claire felt a warmth rise in her cheeks, partly from the fire, partly from the sincerity of his words. She had never been complimented like this, not just on appearance, but on character and resilience. I try," she said softly. "Life teaches you lessons you can't ignore. You learn to keep going even when it's hard." Jack nodded slowly, meeting her gaze with steady eyes. "Exactly. And it's that persistence, that quiet courage, that makes the difference. Not everyone has it, and not everyone recognizes it in themselves." There was a pause, the storm outside continuing without mercy, pressing against the cabin walls with its icy weight. Inside, the quiet intimacy of the space had grown, a subtle tension that neither could deny. Claire felt it in the way her heart raced, in the way her breath hitched slightly when their eyes met, and in the almost electric awareness of each other's presence. Jack moved closer to the fire again, crouching low, and Claire's eyes followed him. She couldn't stop noticing the strength in his movements, the calm confidence in his posture, and the quiet warmth in his presence. The firelight highlighted the lines of his face, the depth of his eyes, and the intensity of his gaze. It was impossible not to feel drawn to him, to feel the pull of the quiet connection that had formed over hours of shared isolation and stormy weather. "You trust me?" Jack said softly, almost a statement, almost a question. His eyes held hers, steady and unflinching. Claire's heart skipped a beat. The statement was simple, but the meaning behind it was profound. She realized she did trust him, in this moment, in this space. She had no choice but to, really. He had provided safety, warmth, and guidance in a situation that could have been dangerous. And beyond that, there was something unspoken, something magnetic, that made her feel safe in ways that went beyond the fire of the cabin. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "I trust you." Jack nodded, accepting her words with a quiet acknowledgement. The tension in the cabin shifted slightly, a new layer forming, a connection deeper than fear, deeper than curiosity. It was understanding, trust, and the subtle awareness of mutual recognition. The storm outside continued, but inside there was a fragile electric calm that neither could ignore. Minutes stretched into an hour, the world outside completely obscured by snow, yet inside, Claire and Jack existed in a space where time felt suspended. Every glance, every subtle movement, every quiet word carried weight. The storm had forced them together, and the intensity of the moment had created a bond that was impossible to deny. Claire sipped the last of her tea, feeling the warmth in her chest and noticing the quiet rhythm of Jack's movements near the fire. She realized that despite the danger outside, despite the isolation, she had found something rare, someone who recognized her strength, who respected her presence, and who made her aware of herself in a way that was both comforting and exciting. Jack glanced at her once more, a soft acknowledgement in his eyes, and Claire felt a flutter in her chest. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin the quiet connection, the trust, and the tension had grown to something tangible, something neither could ignore, something that would define the rest of the night and perhaps much longer. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the mountains, brushing the peaks with pale gold and soft pinks. The storm had finally begun to ease, though the wind still whistled through the trees and the snow lay thick and untouched outside the cabin. Claire sat by the fire, wrapped in a thick blanket, and stared at the glowing embers. Her body was warm, but her mind was still full of the adrenaline and emotion from the night before. She had survived the storm, found shelter, and discovered a connection she hadn't expected, a connection that had grown stronger with every hour of isolation, every shared glance, and every quiet word. Jack was already awake, tending the fire with the same careful attention he had shown the night before. He moved with purpose, stacking logs and adjusting the flames to keep the cabin warm. The morning light filtered in through the windows, illuminating the room in a soft glow, and for the first time Claire could see the cabin in full detail. It was simple, sturdy, and perfectly suited for life in the mountains. Everything in it seemed practical and functional, yet it carried a warmth that spoke of someone who truly understood the value of comfort, of protection, and of simplicity. She watched him quietly, noticing the calm confidence in his movements, the careful attention to detail, and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. The night had been intense, the storm relentless, and yet here he was, steady and composed. There was something magnetic about his presence, a mixture of reliability and quiet awareness that made her feel safe in ways she hadn't realized she needed. "You slept well?" he asked without turning, his voice calm, steady, and carrying just a hint of curiosity. Claire nodded, wrapping the blanket more tightly around her shoulders. "Better than I expected," she admitted, a small smile touching her lips. I feel safe here." Even after everything last night. Jack finally looked at her, his eyes meeting hers with the same steady intensity that had held her attention since the moment she arrived. There was an acknowledgement there, a recognition of everything they had experienced together, and an understanding of the subtle bond that had formed between them. He nodded once, simply, and returned his attention to the fire, letting her words hang in the air without needing to respond further. The storm outside had left the world transformed. Every branch, every rock, every tree was coated in thick, glistening snow. The mountains, which had seemed so dark and forbidding the night before, now appeared calm and almost magical under the morning light. Claire felt a deep sense of awe as she looked out the window, realizing how small she truly was compared to the vastness of nature. Yet, at the same time, she felt a sense of accomplishment, pride, and relief. She had faced the storm, survived it, and emerged on the other side stronger, wiser, and more aware of herself. Jack moved closer to the window, his gaze following hers as she took in the transformed landscape. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly. "The storm can be harsh, but it also shows you the world in a way you'd never see otherwise. Everything becomes clearer, more defined, and even more alive." Claire nodded, feeling the truth of his words. "It's incredible," she said softly, "and peaceful now, after all that chaos." They stood together in silence for a few moments, watching the snow shimmer in the soft morning light. The air was crisp and fresh, and every breath felt clean and invigorating. Claire realized how much the night had changed her, not just physically, surviving the storm, but emotionally and mentally. She had discovered a new sense of resilience, the value of trust, and the unexpected comfort that could come from another person in the most unlikely circumstances. Jack finally turned away from the window, walking slowly back to the fire. He carried a small pot with hot water, preparing tea for both of them. The simple act felt comforting, almost ceremonial, a quiet moment of shared life after a long night of tension and intensity. Claire watched him, noticing the care he took in each movement, the thoughtfulness in every gesture. It was clear that he was someone who valued small acts of kindness and reliability, and the presence of that quality made her feel even more connected to him. "Tea?" he asked, holding out the steaming mugs. Claire accepted hers gratefully, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers and her chest. She took a slow sip, letting the flavor and heat anchor her in the present moment. The fire crackled gently, the cabin was bathed in the soft morning light, and for the first time she felt a deep sense of calm. The storm had passed, the danger was gone, and she was here, alive, warm, and with someone who had proven himself trustworthy in the face of adversity. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "For everything last night, for letting me stay here, for helping me through it." Jack nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "You made it through the storm yourself. I just offered a safe place along the way. The courage was yours, not mine." Claire felt a warmth rise in her chest, both from the tea and from his words. There was sincerity in his voice, a quiet strength that made her feel seen and valued. She realized that trust, courage, and connection weren't just abstract concepts. They were tangible, lived experiences. And in this small cabin, after a night of storm and tension, she had experienced them in their fullest form. The sun rose higher, illuminating the cabin with a warm glow. They moved around naturally, preparing a simple breakfast, tending the fire, and sharing stories in a comfortable rhythm. The storm had left its mark outside, but inside, life resumed slowly, deliberately, and with a new sense of ease. Claire noticed how effortless Jack made it all seem, the calm authority in his actions, the gentle reassurance in his presence. It was a rare quality, one she found herself drawn to more and more with each passing moment. At one point, Jack paused, looking out the window again. "The storm is finally clearing completely," he said. "Soon the trail will be visible again, for you to continue your journey." Claire felt a mix of emotions. Relief, of course. She wanted to continue her travels, to explore the world. But there was also a strange sadness, a recognition that the intimacy, trust, and connection of the past hours might be left behind as soon as she stepped out into the world again. The storm had created a space where they were forced to rely on each other, to notice each other, to connect in ways that the busy, everyday world rarely allowed. She began, hesitating. "I'm going to miss this. All of it. The cabin, the fire, even this quiet time together." Jack's eyes softened and he gave a small nod. "I understand," he said quietly. "Moments like these don't come often, but they matter. They remind you of what's important, of who you are, and of the people who can make a difference, even in unexpected ways." Claire smiled faintly, feeling the truth of his words resonate. The night, the storm, and the small cabin had shown her something she hadn't realized she needed: courage, trust, and the quiet, undeniable power of human connection. It was a memory she would carry with her forever, a story of survival, intimacy, and understanding that had begun with fear and ended with warmth. When the snow had stopped completely, Claire and Jack prepared to step outside. The world had been transformed. Every tree was coated in thick, sparkling snow, and the mountains stood silent and majestic, bathed in the morning sunlight. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the crisp, cold air fill her lungs. She felt alive, invigorated, and ready to continue her journey. Jack stood beside her, watching her quietly. There was a sense of mutual respect in the air, a recognition of everything they had shared and experienced together. The storm had tested them both, and they had emerged stronger, more aware, and more connected than either had anticipated. "You'll be fine," Jack said softly. "The path ahead is clear now. Just remember what you learned about yourself, about trust, and about resilience." Claire nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "I will," she said. "Thank you for everything. For the fire, the shelter, and for showing me what it means to trust someone in the right way." Jack smiled faintly, his eyes meeting hers one last time. "Safe travels, Claire. And remember, storms can be harsh, but they also show you who you are." With that, she stepped into the fresh, sparkling snow, feeling the crunch beneath her boots and the clean, invigorating air fill her lungs. The mountains stretched out ahead, bright and alive, and she knew that the memory of the night, the storm, the cabin, and Jack would stay with her forever. It had been a night of challenge, of fear, of trust, and of connection, a story she would carry in her heart for the rest of her life. The cabin slowly disappeared behind her as she continued along the trail, but the warmth, the lessons, and the quiet bond remained. She smiled softly, knowing that even in the coldest, fiercest storm there was always the possibility of warmth, understanding, and human connection. And for Claire, that realization was worth more than any journey, any mountain, or any adventure she had ever embarked upon.